Welcome to the Building Up Women in Property podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca Bangura, and I'm thrilled to have you join us today. Whether you're a woman aiming to become a confident, impactful leader, or you're a leader committed to promoting gender equity in the property and construction industry, this podcast is designed specifically for you. Join me every week to gain insights and inspiration that will leave you excited and confident about taking your next steps. Thank you for tuning in. Now let's dive into today's topic. Welcome. Today we are talking about the gender pay gap. More specifically, we are diving in to actually understanding what the gender pay gap is, what it means, and why it exists. As many of you no doubt are aware, back in late February, the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, or WGEA, released gender pay equity data. And at the time, there was a big hoo-ha. Everyone was talking about it. And the very short version is that the WGEA data showed us that there was a 21.7% gender pay gap in Australia, meaning that for every dollar a man in Australia makes, a woman is only earning 78 cents. And over the course of a year, that adds up to over $26,000 difference. Now, of course, those numbers are incredibly disheartening. But what the data release also showed was it went into specifics about industries and about employers. And whilst WGEA has been collecting this information for a number of years, this is the first time we've got to see that data by organisation. And it made this data really publicly accessible for employers and employees to have conversations and to talk about these issues in a really meaningful way. But what I've found, and obviously my work as a leadership coach supporting specifically women in the property and construction industry and other male-dominated spaces, is about increasing women in leadership roles. But the reason that is so important is because it's crucial to tackling the gender pay gap and creating gender equality, which is the motivator for me to do this work, right? That is my big why. That is what keeps me up at night. So whilst all this information became available several months ago, at the time it felt like there was just a flurry of finger pointing and calling out particular organisations that were doing terribly and, on the other side, doing really well in this space. And I feel like the dust has now settled and we can use the information we have in a constructive way to help close that gender pay gap that we see. And as many of you know, that 21.7% average gender pay gap I spoke about, that is not a worst case scenario. The worst case scenario was actually in the construction industry where the gender pay gap is actually 28.3%. So in property, in construction, we have a huge amount of work to be done ahead of us, but it is also a really exciting time for someone like me and for those of you listening, whether you're a woman in the industry or a man in the industry looking to create change. This data gives us a starting point to have meaningful conversations and really drive industry change. So with that in mind, today's episode is not about naming and shaming. It is not about finger pointing or criticising decisions that have led to this point. It really is about where do we go from here? And in order to do that, we have to understand this information. Because I work in this space, and to be honest, there's so much data there. There is so much information and how different things are calculated. It's confusing even for me. And if you are new to really exploring this space, then I imagine you might feel a little overwhelmed and confused too. So I want to do today as a bit of an explainer episode so that you can have meaningful conversations with your peers, with your colleagues, with your leadership team, and within the industry to help drive that change so that we can eradicate gender pay inequality. So what is the gender pay gap? Now, I want to give you WGEA's definition of this. They say that the gender pay gap is a measure of how we value the contribution of men and women in the workforce. Now, this is a really important distinction, right? It's about how we value contribution. And so we often communicate this as a percentage or as a dollar amount, but it really shows the difference in earnings between women and men. Now, the gender pay gap is not the same as equal pay. Equal pay is about looking at people in the same role and comparing their salaries. And whilst it's a challenge that has not completely gone away, it is not the primary concern of the gender pay gap. So when we are looking at the gender pay gap, and specifically the WGEA gender pay gap, we are looking at the average remuneration of men minus the average remuneration of women divided by the average remuneration of men. That is how the calculation is made. Now, WGEA provide us the most comprehensive view of salary comparisons that we have available in Australia. Because when they calculate this information, they do a number of things. So first of all, they are using total remuneration. So they are looking at the inclusion of bonuses and benefits and overtime. And the other thing that WGEA's data does, which is really important, is they actually annualize part-time and casual salaries, so that when we are looking at the data, we are looking at like for like in terms of a full-time role. Now, the other information we have about the gender pay gap in Australia is drawn from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, or the ABS. And the ABS data has a gender pay gap of 12%, which is vastly different to WGEA's 21.7. And the reason for that is threefold. First of all, the ABS data is based on a select sample, so it doesn't look at all organisations, whereas WGEA's data looks at all organisations with over 100 employees. So whilst it doesn't capture those small businesses, it is the most comprehensive data we have available. The second difference is the ABS data simply looks at base salaries. And we know that that is not a comprehensive view, because we do have those other elements that have a significant impact on remuneration, including bonuses, including benefits, including overtime. In fact, many roles and people in those roles rely on overtime as part of their salary. So we need to look at this as holistic data. And the other thing is the ABS excludes data for part-time and casual workers. And of course, we have more women in part-time and casual roles. So that data is completely removed, rather than helping to provide a comprehensive view of the pay gap. So when we look at this, the data that is really meaningful in this conversation and is most accurate is certainly WGEA's gender pay gap. But this data is still not fully comprehensive, right? There are a few things that we know are not reflected in the information we have this year. And that is specifically around the inclusion of CEO and head of business remunerations. So for the last reporting period, which was 2022 to 23 data, we have not factored in those top earners within organisations. And given that we know the vast majority of leadership positions across our industry and across, in fact, all industries in Australia are held by men, we know that the inclusion of that data would further increase the gender pay gap information that we have. Now, as of the next reporting period, that information will be included. So we'll actually have a much better view and understanding of the situation in the next lot of data that's released. So in reality, when we are thinking about the gender pay gap here in Australia, we know that the information is going to get worse before it gets better. And I think that's just important to acknowledge, and for each of us to kind of understand how we got to these numbers and what is going to change in future reporting periods. Because one of my biggest frustrations, and I'm sure this may resonate with a lot of you listening, is that every year, particularly around International Women's Day, so many organisations come out and talk about the amazing women that work in their organisations and policies and new initiatives that are intended to drive female participation within their organisation, which of course is great. But quite often, these are empty words, right? What I want to see is the data. I want to see numbers, and I want to see the shift. I want to see what changes year on year so that we can actually see if progress is being made. And what I mean by this is, like, I've seen recently, organizations come out with great parental leave policies, but they also have such a low proportion of their workforce being female that actually it's not that meaningful. And so what would be more meaningful is reporting how many people are taking up parental leave, what number and what percentage, and what the change is over time. And we want to be able to track things, right? And when we can really start to have robust conversations about what matters and what the drivers of change are, that will be when we start to see meaningful change in our industry. And when we talk about the benefits of addressing the gender pay gap, they are huge, right? The first is obviously the impact to women, right? So if we think about the pay difference being over $26,000 a year, and we think about our working lives of, say, 40 odd years, over 40 years, that is a difference of over $1 million. And I know that is a very crass calculation, but I think it's so important for each of us to realize the importance of this. We are not talking about an insignificant amount of money. We are talking about huge sums of money that absolutely have the ability to shift women's lives. And that is tied to so many different areas, right? It has an impact on women's retirement. And in case you're not aware, older women in Australia is the fastest growing demographic of homelessness, because women don't have the funds to support themselves later in life. Women's income also has a huge impact on domestic violence and women's ability to address those challenges. And, the impact to women of this lower salary, it just cannot be understated. So, of course, that's one reason we need to address this. A second reason is that it has an impact on the economy, right? The cost of the gender pay gap is estimated to be $52 billion to the Australian economy. We are not talking about insignificant sums. There is a huge impact on women earning less than men. And from an organisation standpoint, if you want to drive innovation, diversity is the way to do that. And women are a big part of that diversity. And if you want the top talent, you need to be able to attract and retain women into your organisation and into our industries. There is no shortage of reasons why we need to address this issue. And over the coming episodes, I'm going to talk about some of the strategies that we can employ in order to move the needle on this issue, as well as some of the key drivers that lead to this inequality. And, they certainly include things like the lack of flexibility and having biased parental leave that favours women taking time out of the workforce. But I want to leave you with these two thoughts. The first is, if you haven't sat down and had a look at WGEA's website and the data available there, I really want to encourage you to do it. So it is hugely insightful. And I haven't gone into all the stats and all the data here today, but I encourage you to sit down and look at your specific profession, right? So if you think about construction is broken up into different categories, or you may be sitting in the professional services sector. Again, that's broken up into industries, or you may be sitting in real estate. And again, you can get so much data on your specific area, as well as specific data on your organisation. So have a look. Some of this information is really confronting when you see the numbers. And I'm not going to lie, it can be really disheartening. I've poured over this data for hours and hours, and I've looked up different organisations I've worked with, and it is a reminder that there is so much work for all of us to do in this area. And that's the final thing I want to leave you with, is that I look at this and I'm actually full of hope, because I think for the first time we're having honest conversations about the reality of the situation and what is and isn't working. And this information is so useful because it's a platform in which we can start to have really meaningful conversations. We can talk about the strategies that organisations and individuals can employ in order to eradicate the gender pay gap, because we've been talking about this for such a long time, and it's time to create the change. And I think organisations and people that don't actually move the needle in this area, they are going to miss out on attracting and retaining and developing the incredible female talent that we have in this industry. Their bottom line will be impacted by that. So I'll link in the show notes to the WGEA site, and drop me a line on LinkedIn. Come over and say hi. Let me know what you found and perhaps what was shocking or insightful for you when you looked at your employer or your sector. Because the more conversations we can have about this, the more we can move forward as an industry. Okay, there is lots more to come on this topic, but until then, have a beautiful week, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for joining me on the Building Up Women in Property podcast. If you're listening on Apple Podcast or Spotify, I'd love for you to take a moment and review the show if you found it helpful, or share it with a few friends. Thanks again, have a beautiful day, and I'll see you next time.